Hi everyone, and welcome to this RCGP Masterclass focusing on contracts and negotiating skills. I'm Anthony, I'm an ST3 GP trainee, chair of the college's AIT community, and your host today. This series has been created to answer some of those frequently asked questions that many of us build up towards the end of our training, hopefully setting you up for a successful launch into your post-CCT career. We're going to be joined by expert GPs sharing top tips and experiences across a wide range of subject areas. For today's edition, we are joined by a GP who perhaps needs really no introduction, Dr. Surina Chibber. Surina is a portfolio GP and co-founder of My Locum Manager. She's regularly been voted into the list of some of the most influential general practitioners in the UK and has become a real champion for what early career GPs can achieve. And we're delighted that she's been able to join us today. Hi,
Oh,
Surina. Thanks for
hi,
joining.
Anthony.
Is
Thanks
there
for
anything
having
else you'd
me.
like to add?
No, I'm kind of like, wow, that sounds really good. But yeah, no, it's really good to be here, and thank you for having me. It's really it's nice to chat to you. You clearly got the memo about the uniform, so I'm
Yeah.
glad that we're both matching. But no, I'm genuinely really, really happy to have been asked to contribute.
Thank you. So for today's edition, we're going to be talking about contracts and
Mhm.
negotiating skills. And I'm coming up towards the end of my training now and
Yeah.
definitely starting to think about what I should be looking out for when I start looking at those first contracts. So for people in my kind of position, what are the starting points for what you should be thinking about in this situation?
Yeah, I think many people will be in the same boat as you, and you've all gone through, as I did. You go through GP training, like being told where you're going to go, how you're going to work, what hours you're going to work, and then you all of a sudden you come to the end of training and you're asked, okay, so what do you want to do now? And you're like, well, I don't know. I've not really had to think for myself. And you've got to make decisions about contracts, which are legally binding documents, and very few of us have that experience of how to read a contract, how to negotiate a contract, and how to understand what it means. So I'd say the first step before you take on any kind of contract for employment is to really ask yourself, like, what's important for you, first of all, right now, and for the next maybe 3 to 5 years. Because whether you enter into a salaried contract, you'll be bound by that for a number of years. Whether you decide to do a long-term locum post or locum in your area, you will still be working to a contract, which are terms and conditions either you set, but they're agreed by the practice. So therefore they're also binding in that way. And then you also need to think about what type of work you want to do and what that work offers you. So offers you as a job, offers you as an opportunity for personal development, and will it enable you to do things outside of that bubble that will help you kind of develop yourself as a person and your skills as a doctor. And you also need to think about, is the contract that you're reviewing for the place that you're going to work a good fit for you kind of now and for the future? So that's, I think, the main starting point. And from there, what you need to ask yourself when you're given a contract after the interview stage, so normally what will happen is you'll apply for jobs. You might apply for salary jobs, locum, or partnership. You will have an interview of some sort, or some kind of interaction with the practice manager and the team. And then if you decide to go for it, you'll be offered a formal contract as a salary GP or a partner, which you are asked to review and to feedback on. As a locum GP, if you're working directly for a practice, you will then set your terms and conditions, so you know what environment you're going to be working in. With regards to a salaried contract, what you really need to ask yourself is the practice a GMS, PMS, or PMS practice, or is it an APMS practice? And the reason for that really is because you're trying to understand the contract that you're getting. Is it a BMA contract or an equivalent? If it's a GMS practice or a PMS practice, they will offer you a standard BMA contract, which is a very good contract. And I'm going to talk a bit about what to look for in the contract shortly. If it's an APMS practice, they don't have to offer you a BMA contract. It can be any type of contract. So you need to know, is it the BMA contract? And if it's not, what's different? And compare the two in order to make your decision about whether you want to sign it.
Okay. And within that, what are some of the key areas that people should look out for where there could be differences, which would be important to check up on?
Yes, that's a really, really good question about what is the contents of a contract and what should you be looking for. So first of all, contracts usually given within 2 months of starting a job. I know we've all done hospital rotations where when you leave, that's when the contract arrives. But when you started working, it's usually, I think, 2 to 3 months of working where even if you haven't signed the contract, it's assumed you've agreed to the terms and conditions set out in that practice's contract. Now, a contract should explain to you in detail the job title and a brief job description. So what you are expected to do by the practice and what expectations the team has about what duties you're going to be fulfilling. It will also set out your leave entitlement. So the type of annual leave you have, study leave, parental leave is a big one, bank holidays, you know, how many will you be working, what happens on bank holidays with regards to your leave. It will state the hours you're meant to work. It will talk about your pay scale, your pension, and it will talk about whether you're entitled, well, the type of CPD you're entitled to, so continued professional development. So they're the main starting points you really want to look at. The other things it will feature is the contract start date and, importantly, the end date, if that's applicable. Now, most contracts will have a review period. If there isn't a review period in that contract, you really want to ask the practice to put something in. So, you know, a once yearly review of how you're doing and how the practice is doing, and a way to kind of negotiate, you know, how you're going to go going forwards. The sick pay schemes that you're entitled to will be mentioned in the contract as well. And lastly, the procedure for grievance and termination of the contract. And I would say look at that part very carefully, because although you're starting on a really, you know, you've got a good vibe about the practice, interview went great, and now you're reviewing the contract, you kind of want to know if you had to leave, what would the process of that be? Because I have known GPs who've been given contracts where the notice period had been extended to a very, very long time, and they hadn't realised that they'd have to work out another 3 months or sometimes even longer. So I think they're the main key things. So what's the job description? What are you going to be doing? Holidays, study leave and pay, and the grievance procedure and termination of the contract if you need to.
Okay. And I guess within that, in terms of kind of negotiating, what are some of the key areas that you might be able to, I don't know what the best word is, get a better deal on, or how,
Yeah.
and how can you start kind of comparing that? Is it just talking to your peers, or is there a good way to know if you're getting what you're worth, for a better word?
No, I think that's a really good question. So I'm going to ask you a question before I answer that. Do you think you're good at negotiating contracts? Do you think you're good at negotiating?
I'd like to think I'm okay at negotiating, perhaps not my not my work contracts, as I've never had to do it before. But I'd like to think there's a generic skill set that I could use in that situation.
And you're so right. Yeah. So as GPs or GP trainees, we negotiate every single day. You know, doctor, I've got a paper cut. Please, can you refer me to dermatology? Nope, that's not happening. Doctor, I've got a viral cold and antibiotics work every time. Nope, it's not happening. So we negotiate as part and parcel of our day job. I think the difficulty comes when it comes down to money, and when it comes down to you having to say no to something or ask for something, because as GPs, we want to please, we want to do stuff for other people, and we kind of put our needs often on the back burner. And I think that's where the discomfort comes with regards to negotiating contracts. And the other side of it is not knowing what you can negotiate on and what you can ask for. And I think that really is what your question boils down to. How do I know I'm getting a good deal? And, you know, how do I know whether I should be asking for more? Mm-hmm. And I think my tips for that would be, first of all, I would say if you're being offered a standard BMA contract, that in itself is a very, very good contract as a GP, as a salary GP. If you're locuming and you set your terms and conditions, a common question I have is, oh, how do I set it? And you can get a template on the resources section of My Locum Manager, and I'll give you a link for that. But essentially, if you're locuming, you want to think about, well, what does your day look like? How many home visits are you going to do? How much admin are you going to do? And agree that with the practice. Don't say like, this is all I'm doing and that's it. Just say, what would you like me to do? Okay, well, I have this much time in the day and I'd be comfortable doing 2 home visits and some admin and seeing a couple of extras on my usual day. So you set the boundaries. Now, when it comes to salaried contract negotiation, I think you first of all want to know, is it a BMA contract? And if it is, I think you're already in a good, you're in a good space. The other thing you want to know is probably the pay scale. So kind of what the pay rate is compared to another contract that you'd be getting. But for that, I'd say there's a couple of things you need to bear in mind. And I think the first thing is there is no set pay rate for salary GPs. It is on a scale. And most practices will have an affordability of what they can pay you. So you can actually have a look and see the going rate for sessions in an area are usually pretty similar. So practices don't tend to pitch it really high or really low. But I would say if a practice is offering you a rate that's really above and beyond anything you or your friends have come across, you've got to ask yourself why. So I know lots of cases, GPs that have emailed me where they've been given a contract and they're saying, oh my gosh, like you've been offered 9K a session and I've been offered like 10.5K a session. But actually when they read the contract, the duties that they would be doing, they'd often be alone in the practice supervising kind of other clinical staff, non-doctors, and have the responsibility of that, and they'd be really running a lot of the practice by themselves. And I think as a newly qualified GP, the salary reflected those increased responsibilities, but it's a question of what would your work life really be like. The other thing with negotiating, I'd say, is you can negotiate your days that you want to work. You can, to an extent, negotiate the times that you want to work. So the GPs that have other commitments, maybe they're carers for family, or they've got children, or some other commitments or other roles, generally practices are quite flexible. And now with remote working, you can often ask, maybe can I do half a day or a day at home? Can I do my admin from home? Can I be set up for that kind of stuff? And I think most practices will be really happy to support that. So I think with regards to negotiating, first of all, make sure you're on the BMA contract. If you're not on the BMA contract, then that's where you need to see, well, where are the gaps? Are you being given less annual leave days? Are you given less study days? Are you expected to work longer hours? And what's the pay scale like? And how does that fit in with what the average is? I wouldn't go for something that's really high or really low, but how does it fit with the average? And then you need to negotiate. And do you know how you would negotiate that?
I'm more than willing to hear some advice on it. Yeah.
So I think my advice would be, say you've got the contract, and say, for example, you're happy with it, but you think, oh, do you know what? They really want me to work every Friday, and I've got this other commitment every Friday, or whatever it might be, I've got this, or this is my issue with the contract. So what you would do is, in writing, you would acknowledge receipt of the contract. You send an email to the practice manager and say, or the partner, whoever sent you the contract, say, thank you for the contract, I've reviewed it and I'm happy with most of the terms. There was one thing I wanted to discuss with you, which was, for example, doing a session every Friday, or on call every Friday. I feel because I've got these other commitments, I'd like to actually say that I do one in 4 Fridays, or every other Friday, to make it fair. Would you be happy with that? ? Then send it. And so it's a very much open questions and discussion, just like you'd negotiate with a patient. So you'd identify what you're happy with, identify where you feel like for whatever reasons you'd like to change, and then find out what the opportunity is to change.
Yeah. Okay. And
does that make sense?
That does definitely make sense, yeah. And like you say, it has a lot of familiarity just because of the way that our consultations often go with patients.
Yeah.
I guess on purely on the issue of pay, when we're looking at pay, this is maybe just my ignorance, but in terms of like the amount you get paid going up with time, is that something that will be commonly included in a contract, or something we should be thinking about, or is that fairly set for a period of time once you've signed it?
So again, it depends on the contract. So having a pay review as part of your annual review in a contract would be fair to ask for if it's not there. And I think when you start at a practice, and if it's a new practice, it's very much a learning curve for you and the practice. And then as you take on more responsibilities and do more, the number of sessions you might do might change. You might take over a more managerial role. You might start overseeing certain things in the practice. So just an example from my perspective as a locum GP, in the practices where I regularly locum, I went from starting and just doing a few days, then essentially doing their weekend clinic, which I'd run with another GP, to then supervising their medical students in teaching, but obviously that was all paid for, and my pay increased incrementally as my duties increased there. But it's not like I started at that level. I kind of worked over time and found out what fit with me. And same, like if you're going in as a salary GP, you might decide after a year being there that you really enjoy dermatology and you want to do a special interest in dermatology. So then you'd have a conversation with the practice. How do you bring that interest in? And you might then offer all the derm services for the area from that practice. So your pay scale would change according to that role changing. So a pay review, I think, is definitely an important thing to have as part of your contract. It doesn't mean your salary will go up every year, though. I think, there has been a big squeeze on primary care and general practice. But I think as long as you're not doing more for less and you've kind of offset that, that should be okay, as long as the review period is there and it's mutually agreeable.
Okay. And then on the kind of flip side of, you've done all this successful negotiating, you've got a contract that you think is good, and you accepted a job somewhere. What should we do if then we're running into trouble, elements of the contract aren't being kept to, we're feeling that actually maybe things that we had agreed to were not, in hindsight, were not the best? Is there any way that we can kind of negotiate that later on or change things?
Yes, that's a really good question. So with regards to contract, I'd say once you've got a contract, I would say, just if you don't have BMA membership, maybe just get it for that time, but get them to review your contract for you. Get a professional to cast eyes on it, especially if you're signing a contract where you're planning to be for a good number of years. It's definitely worth that investment. And there's lots of support resources online as well for that. But I'd say get a professional body like the BMA to review your contract, make sure you're happy. And then if you find that over time things aren't being adhered to, or there's, I don't know, like, maybe some boundaries are being overstepped, I think my first point of call would be to speak to your team, your practice team. So, bring it up with maybe the practice manager or whoever you have a good relationship with at the practice, and have it as a first of all conversation, like give your side of it. And often the other party doesn't really realize that was even an issue. And so then things, usually what happens in over 95% of cases is, once you've raised a grievance, and it doesn't have to be like, oh my god, I'm doing this and I wasn't supposed to. It could just be like, look, we'd agreed this, and actually the last few weeks I've noticed this is happening. You'd agree to resolve it. And then I think that's usually the way most things go. I think if it doesn't work on that point of view and you're raising it as an additional grievance, and maybe you've decided you're going to leave because you can't resolve it, then you can get representation from, for example, like your LMC, to support you and to help negotiate or to help you kind of get a satisfactory exit. You may, usually in that circumstance, if you're going to leave, generally what people do is they might feel like, okay, this isn't for me, and they'll look for another role, and then they'll move on, give their notice, and then they'll move on. But I think before that is really end stage. Usually just bringing it up as a discussion and putting changes in place is the most common way to resolve that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, that's a really brief beginner's guide to contracts and negotiating. And already from just the few minutes that we've been able to talk together, I already feel like it's a lot of things are a bit clearer in my head.
Oh, good.
And I think, like, just actually recognizing that we do, part of our training over the last 3+ years has all been about doing this well. It's just applying those skills to a different setting, I think, is a really important thing that I'm going to definitely take away from chatting. Is there any other kind of top tips or key takeaways that you'd like people to be thinking about or remember today?
So yeah, my top tips would be, when it comes to deciding on what role you're going to do and negotiating the contracts or negotiating that role, really think about, first of all, what's important to you. And also, the contract is just part and parcel of any role you do. Like, look at what the culture of a practice is. So, what do they do for fun? How do they support each other? Like, is it a fun place to work? Does it share your values? Because that is something that no contract can really define, and that really will dictate more than a really ironclad contract whether or not you're happy at work. Then I think using resources. So we're not skilled in contract appraisal or kind of rewrites, but there's lots of resources like the BMA that are, so you can definitely tap into that, especially when it's your first contract. And I think the other thing I'd say, so in terms of resources, and my last top tip is the webinar link that I shared with you, which goes into this in much more detail. I'm happy to share that because that covers it in kind of a more deeper dive. But they are my main tips. Find out what's important to you. understand what you're signing and how to get out, and get a professional body to review it so that you're happy that you're signing the right thing for you.
Great. I think that's yeah, really valuable information that all of us will take away. And as Surina says, we're going to be sharing some links to some additional resources that all of you can take a look at to dive a bit deeper into this area, because it's obviously a lot to talk and think about when it comes to contracts and negotiating. But hopefully this has provided kind of just a general overview of some of the key things that we're all going to be thinking about as we take those first steps into our post-CCT careers.
Yeah, you'll all be fine. It's honestly, it's great on the other side. Just making that leap.
Yeah, I'm the closer we get, the more and more ready for it I feel I'm getting anyway. So I'm looking forward to it. But this is why I think things like this are just so important to help
Yeah,
ease
definitely.
that transition as much as possible.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Surina. It's been a pleasure to talk, and thank you everybody for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.